Why do you think scientific communities do have such a hard time with faith relative to, academic scientifics particularly?
Abraham's watching.
Academia seem to have such a hard time with faith. And I think that's particularly a problem for me because it seems to me that someone who is in science, they're not really affected. Like if they're not, faith based or anything, they don't really have to think about it. It doesn't really come up in their day to day, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not on their list of things for explanations for things. Why is it that science, more than computer science, more than any other career or field, seems to just not be able to, like, it's been a centuries long effort to try to reconcile science and faith. Why does it seem people are failing?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I don't have like a concrete
No, I
answer
mean,
for
I
like
mean, it's a pretty
why,
important question to some
but
degree, otherwise someone would have done it, right?
hmm I think a lot of it comes down to not being able to use the scientific language to explain phenomenon that's kind of like out there or seen as like crazy. Um, and not that I don't think it's crazy, but like there's that unexplainable it's almost like dismissed because if you can't explain it in the language that's available to you, how do you like
Touch it at all? How do you interact with it at all?
yeah, exactly. And I think major problem with kind of from our end with Christians, Christian language is heavily outdated, especially in terms of um, there's so many negative connotations around certain words within Christianity because there was the whole like Constantine era and moving like the faith forward, and it got used in a lot of negative ways for power, for authority, for ways that I mean, like anything, right? It's used for good and bad, and the faith has been used for bad. Um, so it's how do you reclaim that language or get at the meaning of the original language and change those terms so that people can enter into an actual conversation? Because there's so much like Christianese around what the faith is. And I don't know, like, you're relative, like, you've only been a Christian for 2 years now? Something like that. So, like, you're relatively new compared to, like, I grew up in the church, and, like, even though I wasn't a Christian for a while, and kind of left and everything, I was familiar with the terminology when I was trying to grapple with whether or not I wanted the faith. So I knew the terms, I knew what the individuals using them meant by it, and not what that broader kind of historical um, tainted version of it was, right? So I think to a degree we really need to reevaluate like how we're talking about these things and how inaccessible the language actually is to the general public now. Um, because I think that makes a huge difference into how people interact with faith, into how whether or not they see it as valid. And yeah, so I think we really need to start with re-exploring the language and how we approach different concepts within the faith and how we're displaying those. So I would say that's where to start. I don't think it's a solution in and of itself, but I think that that's one thing we do need to reevaluate and to also learn how to use the science and the language of science in that as well. Because there is a lot of evidence for things in science for stuff that's talked about in the faith or in the Bible, even um, and even just some traditions that have been passed down. And I'm not saying to hold on to every tradition. I think that that's traditionalism can be dangerous in of itself, but I do think there's some value in there. But it's a matter of articulating it and learning how to articulate it and to use the language of science to express those same themes, if that makes sense.
To just try to make them seem less other to each other, essentially.
Yeah,
Let's show
yeah.
them where they are similar.
And
Maybe,
like
point out you guys agree here.
Mhm. Well,
Something
and
like that.
even where they're vastly different, being able to access it through language that is actually showing how they're different rather than these, it's really easy. Like, so for example, in science, especially in psychology, you always need to define your variables and what they mean because one variable can mean five different things in five different studies. And sometimes it can mean five different things in three different studies if they're using it in different contexts. Like language, I think science does a really good job of laying it out there. So I think sometimes when we're using terms to the science community, they have a different view on what that term even means. And even if it is something different that we're talking about than what they believe, their interpretation of what we're talking about is so far out from what we're actually talking about that it's really hard to even build that bridge or have that level of respect for the different belief because it sounds so out there or so bizarre or so inaccessible that they don't even know what we're talking about. Because I actually think, for the most part, the science community actually does a pretty good job of respecting other views, even if they don't agree with them. But if you can't articulate them in a way that says, I have evidence for this, and it doesn't have to be evidence that they agree with, but I think that's where we fail, is we're using these terms that suggest we don't have any evidence in our lives for what we believe, and it's just kind of like, or this idea that, oh, you just have to have faith. Well, like, what does that mean? But like, if you actually break faith down, and it's like, well, I've spent time grappling with this and thinking through it. It's not like faith was this thing that just came out of the air and we're like, oh, I'm just going to blindly trust, which to a lot of people, the term faith means just blindly trust. And I don't think that that's, and I think there's like moments for where you have to grapple with your faith and just trust, even though you can't fully see. But I don't think faith is complete blindness. I don't think at any point, like if you follow the life of Jesus and how he lays things out and shows people, like, yes, he gets frustrated at times because he's like, you're still not seeing, but I don't think he's ever um, leaving people completely blind. Like, he does the miracles and then he gets frustrated that they don't make the connection between that sign and the fact that he's God and like stuff like that. And he's very patient with them. I don't mean to say that he gets like super frustrated and angry, but like I think we have taken faith to be this completely blind thing, which when you look at how Jesus interacted with people, his first sentence to people was not, I'm God, believe me. And that would be more like blind faith, right? But he actually demonstrates
He
and,
gives some evidence, and yeah.
yeah, and brings them to a place of being able to build up their faith. Whereas I think one of the main things that the science community has difficulty with is that term faith. And I think as Christians, we've gotten it really wrong in some circumstances. And we kind of just like throw it out there like this tagline, like, oh, you just have to have faith. Like, if someone's struggling enough, it's like, oh, have more faith. And
Yeah, and especially when you
yeah,
have a community like the scientific community, which is 97%, or I don't know what it's at right now, but ever increasingly unfaithful or unreligious in any sense. These terms are not being explained to anybody in these contexts, or at
no,
least not at a level that is effective.
yeah,
So I really do think you're right. And if people were to, like, for example, compare their faith in that Jesus existed to the faith that Alexander the Great existed, for example, and you're to ask
mm-hmm.
them why they believe Alexander the Great lived, but not Jesus. It's one thing, like, and I have had this conversation, like, with some people. Do you believe that Jesus existed at all, whether or not he was God? And some people will say no.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to wonder, like, why? Well, like, because we have a lot more evidence for Jesus at least existing than
Mm-hmm.
we do for many ancient figures, like
Yeah,
Alexander the Great's a great example because we have lots of secondary writings from him, but nothing even original.
mm-hmm.
Um, that there's just obviously some culture of just identifying it as religious and saying, "Oh no, that's not for me," and the lack of communication there is something I think, yeah, it is important. People don't say the word faith in Alexander the Great; they just believe that he exists.
Yeah.
But to some level, there is a faith there.
There's
You believe that he is
exactly.
not just um, a story made up by ancient people or anything like that. And I think there's sufficient evidence to have good faith that Alexander the Great existed, but I think there's good faith to have to believe that Jesus existed as well.
Mm-hmm.
And why those two things are treated as different, I think, is very interesting. And I don't know if it's obviously some cultural thing. I don't know what level to attribute it to,
Well,
historical or just current social interactions or language, as you were saying. People in science are unlikely to ever say they had faith in a theory or in a hypothesis, but that's generally what they're doing. They're
mm-hmm.
making little leaps.
Yeah, and I think that's where the disconnect of the language comes, right? Because if we're using faith in that context, but they don't use that term because that's not how they see the term faith. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so switching those language patterns and getting like there's so much with meeting people where they are, whereas I feel like the Christian culture, and again that term, like we don't even have a Christian culture anymore, but we want people to meet us where we are because for so many years we were privileged with being so intricate in the culture, but that's not the case anymore, and I think we haven't really let go of that yet. So rather than, like, if you look at the life of Jesus, he's constantly stepping into people's lives and meeting them where they're at. The language style he uses is different between different people. I was in a Bible study a couple days ago and we were talking about, like, Jesus before Pilate speaks a language of power and authority because Pilate's in a position of authority and power and he understands it. Whereas that's very different than when Jesus is at the well with the Samaritan woman, and the language he uses with her is very more accessible to her, and like his style of speaking is different depending on who he's with, and he really meets people where they are and with what they understand. Whereas I feel like Christians in North America have this expectation that people are going to come and meet us where we are, and it's kind of like that privilege still. We haven't let go of that privilege that we used to have, and we expect people um,
Yeah,
to
we don't have to relate to you. Come relate to us.
exactly, yeah. Yeah, and we would never say it that way, and I don't think that it's necessarily something we do completely consciously. I think a little bit of it is subconsciously, but it's definitely playing out where we want that respect of the privilege rather than us coming on equal level and going, okay, where are you at? Where can I meet you at? And like, and we don't even, it's a false privilege because we don't even have that privilege anymore, but we're still acting like we do. So I think that that's really problematic.